The young doctor who rushed to help the assaulted old flower seller had no idea he was kneeling before his own biological mother. He only saw an 80-year-old woman, Beatrice, with a bleeding lip and trembling hands, picking up crushed flowers from the pavement. The attacker, a wealthy woman named Sharon Montgomery, had just walked away, leaving behind a scene of public humiliation. What seemed like a simple act of arrogance was actually the moment that began to unravel a secret buried for over half a century: a stolen child, a fabricated identity, and a love that never died. If you are listening from anywhere in the world, please leave a comment and subscribe, because there are truths that need to be spread, even if they might shake your beliefs. There are stories, no matter how painful, that must be told. Roses, lilies, daisies, crushed by the shiny heels of a well-dressed woman, with a designer handbag hanging from her arm and an expression of superiority etched on her face. "I told you not to offer me anything. Learn some respect," the woman shouted, looking at her as if she were worthless. The crowd froze. Some covered their mouths, others pretended not to look. A little girl let go of her mother's hand, frightened by the sound of the blow. And in the midst of that shameful scene, Beatrice, 80 years old, said not a single word. She didn't defend herself. She didn't cry. She just slowly bent down with trembling knees to pick up a broken flower. And then she looked up. She looked at her, but not with anger. She looked at her with a sadness so deep that even the woman who hit her averted her eyes, uncomfortable with that silence that hurt more than any complaint. "What are you doing, ma'am? Are you okay?" asked a firm and concerned male voice. It was a doctor in his early 50s, tall, with light brown hair beginning to gray at the temples, a white coat, and a first aid backpack slung over his shoulder. He was the only one who approached, the only one who touched Beatrice's arm gently, the only one who seemed to see her as a human being. "I'm all right, son. Don't you worry. I've been hit by worse things than a hand," she said in a voice as fragile as a whisper, as a drop of blood trickled from the corner of her lip. "And if you, who are listening to this, were moved by this scene, wait, because what you are about to discover will completely change the way you see this story. But before we continue, if this story touches your heart, I invite you to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. And tell me in the comments from which country and city you are watching this. We love to know how far these stories reach." Beatrice slowly stood up, with a split lip and a withered flower between her fingers. Around her, the hustle and bustle of downtown Seattle had turned into an uncomfortable, almost cruel silence, not for lack of people, but because everyone chose silence as a shield. No one wanted to get involved. No one wanted to bear the discomfort of that scene. She didn't look at the ground. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for help. Her eyes, however, seemed to speak, and what they said was impossible to ignore. The doctor, Ethan, knelt before her, gently holding her by the elbow. His firm hands, accustomed to saving lives, trembled slightly at the contact with that skin aged by the sun and the years. "Are you sure you don't need me to check on you?" he asked, lowering his voice as if he were afraid of breaking her further. Beatrice barely nodded. Behind them, Sharon Montgomery turned on her heels and walked away without looking back. The murmuring of the onlookers began to rise like foam. That the woman was a despot, that the old woman had done nothing, that someone should do something, but as always, no one did. Ethan watched the rich woman walk away and then looked back at Beatrice. That face was not entirely unfamiliar to him. There was something in those eyes, something that squeezed his chest in a way he couldn't explain. "Do you have anyone who can come for you?" he asked carefully. "No one comes for me, young man. It's been years since I've had anyone come for me," she replied in a dry voice, without resentment, without pity, just as one states a truth repeated so many times that it no longer hurts. He offered to walk her home. She, after hesitating for a few seconds, accepted, and so they walked together through the old stone streets of downtown, with the sun setting softly on the historic rooftops. People watched them, some with pity, others with indifference. "My name is Ethan," he said, breaking the silence. "Beatrice," she replied. He wanted to ask more, but something in the way she looked straight ahead, with her lips pressed together and the flower still in her hand, made him stay quiet. He understood, without anyone explaining it to him, that this woman was not broken by that day's blow. She had been broken long before. Upon arriving in the Beacon Hill neighborhood, Beatrice pointed to a small house with worn walls and rusty railings. Ethan helped her up the 3 entrance steps. She thanked him with a slight nod, but before closing the door, she looked at him again. It was a long, deep look, as if she were analyzing him or searching for him. And Ethan, for a moment, felt that this woman was not looking at him, but at someone else, someone she thought was lost, someone she once loved. That night, while having dinner alone in his downtown apartment, he couldn't stop thinking about that look. It was unsettling, familiar, as if he had seen it in another time, in another place, in another body. He got up from the table, walked to the bathroom mirror, and stared at himself, but found no answers. Only that for the first time in many years, he felt watched by someone he thought no longer existed. As soon as she crossed the threshold of her house, Beatrice closed the door with a gentle push. For a long moment, she stood in the dim light, not turning on the lamps, allowing the silence of the empty rooms to envelop her. The crushed flower was still in her right hand, its broken stem, a mirror of her own life. For 50 years she had cultivated a fragile peace, a quiet resignation built on the ashes of her past. Days bled into one another, marked only by the changing seasons and the flowers she sold. But today, that peace was shattered. It wasn't the humiliation in the square, nor the sting of the slap. It was the young doctor's eyes, the gentleness in his touch, the way he had hummed a tune, a fragmented melody that plucked a string deep within her soul, a string she thought had long since snapped. She walked slowly to the small kitchen table, not with the weariness of an old woman, but with the cautious steps of someone treading on forgotten ground. She placed the flower in a glass of water, a futile attempt to revive it. His face lingered in her mind, not just the kindness, but the faint scar on his cheek, the way his brow furrowed in concern. These were details a stranger wouldn't notice, but to a mother's heart they were echoes. For the first time in decades, she didn't just remember her son. She felt him. A painful, hopeful presence stirred from a long slumber. The wound hadn't just scarred over, it had begun to ache again. She got up, opened the old wardrobe, and took out an embroidered cloth bag. From inside, she extracted a cardboard folder with documents and clippings taped with yellowed tape. On the first page, a birth certificate. On the second, a filed police report. And at the end, a small, faded photo of a boy sitting on a wooden tricycle with big eyes and a faint scar on his cheek. She looked at it for a long time. Then, without much thought, she looked down at her nightstand. There was a music box that hadn't played in years. She wound it gently, and a sweet, simple melody began to play. It was then that her eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of memory, because that melody, that very same melody, was the one she had heard hours earlier in the square, when the young Ethan, without realizing it, began to hum it while helping her up. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. A mother's intuition is a powerful thing, a compass that never truly loses its north. That melody wasn't just a random tune, it was a key, a thread pulling Beatrice back through time. But hope can be the most dangerous thing of all, and you have to wonder, is this a path to the truth or to even greater heartbreak? Hope was a dangerous thing, a flickering candle Beatrice had learned to snuff out before it could burn her. But this time, the flame refused to die. It wasn't enough to just remember, she needed to know. Her gaze drifted towards the window, towards the house next door. Clara, her silent neighbor for over 30 years. Clara, who saw everything from behind her curtains but never spoke a word. They had a relationship built on unspoken understanding, shared cups of sugar, and acknowledging nods across the alley. But Beatrice always sensed something more behind Clara's silence, a deep, ancient sadness. Perhaps, just perhaps, that silence held more than just her own secrets. Gathering a resolve she hadn't felt in years, Beatrice stood up. She had to ask. Even if she was met with a blank stare, she had to try. The dawn in Beacon Hill was cold and silent. Beatrice woke before the first rooster crowed, with the feeling that this morning was not like the others. She sat on the edge of the bed and, without much thought, lit the small oil lamp. The dim light illuminated the peeling walls and the wooden dresser that held the secrets of her life like an altar. She opened the same metal box she had used the night before. Among the papers tied with a blue ribbon and the dried flowers, there was a yellowish envelope, and beneath it, a black and white photograph that had always weighed on her heart. It was the image of a 5-year-old boy with a restless gaze and a small wooden tricycle. He was wearing a hand-knitted sweater with uneven stripes and smiling, unaware that this smile would be frozen in time. Beatrice took the photo with both hands, brought it to her face as if to smell it, and her fingers traced the frayed edge of the paper. The boy's gaze seemed to penetrate her from another time. It was her son, Michael James, just before everything fell apart. That portrait was the last photo taken of him before the fire in Snoqualmie, the day her life was split in two. Her heart was beating fast. She closed her eyes and let the memories return like a dark river overflowing after years of drought. She remembered the big house in Snoqualmie, with its hallways full of potted geraniums, the smells of freshly baked bread her husband brought from town, and the laughter of the boy playing with a ball in the yard. She also remembered the hot wind of that fateful afternoon, the smell of smoke before seeing the flames, the neighbors' shouts, the chaos of trying to save something, anything, and above all, she remembered the most painful image. The moment she lost sight of her son in the smoke, she pressed the photograph to her chest, clutching it tightly. It was impossible to forget that moment, but there was something that never fit, something that haunted her every night. She never found the body. There was never a goodbye. No one explained to her why the hospital records disappeared. No one told her who took her son in the midst of the disaster. She opened her eyes with a start, as if waking from a bad dream, and looked at the photo again. There was a detail she hadn't noticed before. In the bottom right corner, engraved in pencil, were barely visible initials. The same ones she had seen embroidered on a baby's handkerchief stored in that same box. The same ones that were now beginning to echo in her head with an insistent resonance. The early morning wind came through the window, gently moving the curtains. The metal box remained open on the bed, its papers and flowers peeking out like silent witnesses to a secret. Outside, the bells of the neighborhood church began to ring. Beatrice got up, walked to the door, and looked at the empty street. She thought of Ethan, his eyes, the melody he hummed without knowing it, the sense of familiarity he had caused her. She pressed her lips together, felt a tremor run through her hands. Something inside her that had been dormant for decades was beginning to stir, a premonition she didn't know if it was hope or fear. And just at that moment, as she was closing the door to make herself a coffee, she heard a soft knock on her gate, a brief, almost timid tap that made her turn around with a racing heart. She sat on the bed with the paper in her hand and the boy's photograph still on her lap. The image of the drawing churned her stomach. It was the same type of drawing her son used to make when he was learning to hold a pencil. The same way of drawing suns with exaggerated rays. She put it in the metal box, next to the withered flower and the tied papers. And then, at the bottom, she saw something she hadn't touched in years. A hardcover notebook, blackened and half-burned. She took it out carefully. The edge crackled as if it could crumble to dust. It was her diary, or rather, the diary where she wrote little notes about Michael James' childhood. His first words, home remedies for fevers, the songs she sang to him. Part of the notebook had burned in the fire. The pages were stuck together, some with water and smoke stains. As she opened it, the smell of old paper and ash hit her. The first pages were almost illegible, but when she reached the middle, between gray pages, a handwritten song appeared. The letters were clear, neat, adorned with little stars on the sides. It was the same song she used to sing to her son to sleep, the same one she had heard the young doctor humming in the square just hours before. Her fingers traced the lyrics as if it were a prayer. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. She closed her eyes and sang it softly, barely a murmur. Suddenly, the melody was no longer a memory, but an invisible thread that connected her with that unknown young man. Something inside her began to tremble. It couldn't be a coincidence. She turned the pages more carefully. She found a list of things to take on a trip, notes about the Snoqualmie market, phone numbers that no longer existed, and at the end, on a half-burned page, a note in red ink. Never forget. Scar on left cheek. The sentence took her breath away. In the boy's photo, indeed, that scar was visible. And in the square, when Ethan bent down to help her, she could have sworn she saw a small mark in the same place on his face. The dawn was breaking, and the sunlight began to filter through the window, drawing golden lines on the floor. Beatrice closed the diary, pressed it to her chest, and stood up. She walked to the kitchen to make coffee, but her hands were trembling so much that she spilled some water on the stove. She couldn't get that melody, that scar, that drawing out of her mind. She sat down at the table again. Her gaze swept the room as if she expected someone to appear at any moment. She knew that life had taken too much from her to be playing with her now, but she also knew that a mother's intuition is rarely wrong. And at that moment, more than ever, she felt that the truth was close, within reach. A noise pulled her from her thoughts. This time, it wasn't a knock on the gate or a paper under a rock, it was something different. Footsteps, firm footsteps approaching down the neighborhood alley. Footsteps that stopped right in front of her door. In the Montgomery mansion, high up in the old neighborhood of Seattle, the dawn had a different tone. The heavy velvet curtains blocked the morning light, and the hallways smelled of wax and expensive perfume. Everything there seemed calm, but the air was thick with an invisible tension. Sharon Montgomery paced her office, arms crossed and brow furrowed. She hadn't slept the night before. The scene in the square kept replaying in her head like a broken record. The old-fashioned telephone on her desk rang. She answered it immediately, her voice firm. "I don't want anyone talking about what happened yesterday. No one. Not a word at the club, not in the press, not at church. Understood?" On the other end, her assistant hesitated before replying yes. Sharon hung up abruptly, walked to the window, and barely pulled back the curtain. From there, she could see part of the city center. Her gaze fixed on the cobblestone streets where the public humiliation had occurred. She gritted her teeth. "Nosy old woman," she muttered to herself. "I won't let an old woman risk everything I've built." But even as she tried to convince herself it was a minor issue, something deeper than anger was eating at her inside. Fear. Beatrice's silent gaze had disarmed her. It was as if in those eyes she had seen a piece of her own past, one that had been buried for years under layers of appearances. The sound of heels on the marble pulled her from her thoughts. It was Clara, her housekeeper, who entered with a tray of coffee. She left the tray on the table, and with a cautious voice, dared to speak. "Mrs. Sharon, a lot of people saw what happened yesterday. They're talking about it at the market, in the square, everywhere." Sharon turned quickly. "I told you no one is to talk about it," she cut her off sharply. "And you keep quiet too, Clara. If I find out a single word leaves this house, I won't be responsible." Clara looked down and left without another word. The door closed, leaving a thick silence. Sharon took a deep breath and sat in the leather armchair. On the table, among magazines and papers, was a photo of Ethan as a child on his first day of school. She picked it up unintentionally, and looking at it, she felt a lump in her throat. There was something in that photo that didn't fit, but she forced herself to put it down, face down. At that moment, her cell phone rang. It was a message from an unknown number. "Secrets don't stay buried forever." The sentence left her cold. That's the thing about secrets, isn't it? You can build walls of wealth and power, but the past always finds a crack to seep through. For Sharon, that anonymous message isn't just a threat. It's the sound of her entire world beginning to fracture. And you have to wonder, who's on the other side of that message, and what exactly do they know? She looked around the office as if someone were watching her. She clenched her fist and turned off the phone abruptly. "I won't be blackmailed," she whispered. "Not after all this time." She got up and paced the house like a caged animal. She went up to the attic where she kept old documents and opened a trunk covered with a blanket. Inside were file boxes, old receipts, and letters from her mother. As she took one out, the smell of old paper and dampness filled the air. She read a couple of lines, and her face changed. She hurriedly put everything back, breathing heavily. She locked the trunk and put the key in her pocket. She went downstairs with a firm step and ordered the driver to get the car ready. She needed to get out, clear her head, think. The driver asked where to. She didn't answer, just said, "Take me downtown. I have to see something for myself." As the car descended the streets connecting the upper area with the historic center, Sharon looked out the window. The same streets where Beatrice sold flowers, the same walls that had witnessed the blow. Her jaw was tense, but her gaze was filled with a strange mix of fear and rage. When they arrived at the square, the flower stand was empty. Only a few dry petals remained on the ground, carried by the wind. Sharon stared for a few seconds, her heart beating faster and faster. Something told her that this old woman was not just any old woman. Something told her that her carefully constructed world was about to crumble. The uncomfortable driver asked if she would get out of the car. She didn't answer. She kept looking at the empty stand until, in the distance, she saw a familiar figure walking decisively through the crowd. She leaned toward the glass to see better. Her eyes narrowed because she instantly recognized that silhouette. It was Ethan. Ethan walked firmly among the vendors of the square, nodding to those who recognized him. He had his white coat slung over his arm and a serious expression on his face. Since the night before, something had been bothering him. He had returned home with the feeling that the encounter with the old woman could not be forgotten. There was something about her, something beyond the blow, the scandal, the indignation, something he couldn't name but felt in his chest like a persistent pang. He passed a hot dog cart without stopping. The smell hit him, but his mind was elsewhere. When he reached the corner where it had all happened, he stopped. The flower stand was gone. Only some stains on the sidewalk and a few dry petals swept by the wind remained. He bent down, carefully picked one up, and held it between his fingers. She didn't come back, he murmured to himself. He turned to ask a newspaper vendor who was sweeping the front of his stall. "Excuse me, the flower lady, the one who was here yesterday. Do you know if she'll be here today?" The man looked him up and down, recognized him, and in a low voice replied, "That lady is from the old days, the kind who doesn't harm anyone. I've seen her arrive for years, every day at the same time, but nothing since yesterday." She left in silence. Ethan thanked him and continued walking. He didn't know what was driving him to look for her, but he felt he had to see her again. Not out of compassion, it was something else, a need he couldn't explain in words. The way she had looked at him, that mix of surprise, pain, and an ancient tenderness, was spinning in his head. He stopped at a park bench and took a notebook from his backpack, where he jotted down stray thoughts, ideas, fragments of stories his patients told him. He looked for a clean page and wrote without thinking, "The woman of silence knows me from another life." After writing it, he stared at the sentence. He didn't know why he had used those words. He looked at the sky, then at his watch. The community pharmacy where he worked in the mornings was about to open. He put the notebook away, but before getting up, he looked again at the street where the florist had been. He felt a pang. He promised himself he would ask around the neighborhood again that night. He had to know where she lived. He had to see her again. As he walked toward the pharmacy on the other side of the park, Sharon continued to watch him from inside the parked car. Her look was not one of surprise, but of suspicion. There was something in Ethan's attitude that made her nervous. She didn't like to see him like this, distracted, absorbed, connected to something other than his work, his career, his controlled life. She hit the seat with her hand and ordered the driver to take her back home. As the car started, her mind went back to the previous night, to the anonymous message she had received, and to the documents she had hidden again in the depths of the attic. She couldn't let the past return, especially not now, when Ethan was so close to something he didn't even know he was looking for. That night, when he closed the clinic, Ethan didn't go home. He took a different route. He walked through the Beacon Hill neighborhood, guided by vague references some merchants had given him. "She lives near the old church," they told him, "a house with rusty railings and broken pots." He searched street by street without telling anyone who he was looking for. He didn't want to alarm or inconvenience anyone. When he finally saw it, he knew it was the place. The rusty gate, the faded color of the facade, the dried flowers at the entrance. He knocked gently, not knowing what he would say if she opened. He waited a few seconds. No one answered. He knocked again, this time a little harder. On the other side, a shadow moved. The wooden door creaked open, and there she was, Beatrice, with the same calm face, but her eyes bright, as if she already knew he would come, as if she had been waiting for him for many years. The air was thick that afternoon in the Beacon Hill neighborhood. The Seattle sky was covered with low, gray clouds that promised rain, though not a drop was falling. Inside Beatrice's small house, everything was silent, except for the sound of the kettle boiling on the stove and the faint ticking of the old clock hanging next to the image of the Virgin Mary. Beatrice and Ethan were sitting across from each other, at the dining table. Between them, 2 steaming cups of coffee and a tension that neither of them dared to break. It wasn't discomfort, it was something deeper, more ancient, as if the air between them was charged with questions they didn't know how to ask. "Thank you for coming," she finally said in a calm voice. "I didn't expect you to." "I couldn't rest easy," Ethan replied without much thought. "I don't know why, but I felt I had to see you." She looked down, fidgeting with her fingers on the cup. Her hands were wrinkled but firm, like someone who has worked the earth, the flowers, life itself. She looked at him for a moment and asked if he was from Seattle. Ethan nodded, but he didn't know much about his history. He knew what his adoptive mother, Sharon, had told him, that she had received him from a midwife friend of the family, that there were no other details, only that he was given away by a woman who couldn't raise him. "And you never wanted to look for that woman?" Beatrice asked in a voice that seemed to fear its own question. "I don't know if it was fear or resignation," Ethan replied, "but sometimes I wake up with the feeling that someone is waiting for me, someone who thinks that I don't know, that I'm dead." Beatrice felt her soul break in two. She pressed her lips together and hid the tears that burned in her eyes. She couldn't. She mustn't say anything yet. Not without proof, not without certainty. The only thing she could do was listen to him and watch him well, watch him speak, watch him breathe, see the way he moved his hands, how he frowned, how he fell silent. It was like seeing Michael James, her son, through the mirror of time. "Can I ask you a question?" Ethan said, interrupting her thoughts. "Did you know me from before?" Beatrice took a moment to answer. She looked at him with such deep sadness that the young man felt a shiver. "No," she said firmly, "but your eyes reminded me of something I thought I had lost forever." They fell silent. Outside, the first rumbles of thunder were heard in the distance. Ethan looked at the clock. He had to go. He thanked her for the coffee and the chat, but before saying goodbye, he took one of the flowers Beatrice had in a vase on the shelf. It was a white lily. "Can I take this flower?" he asked. "Of course," she replied with a faint smile. "It's good for those who are looking for answers." Ethan left, and as soon as he closed the door, Beatrice felt her legs give way. She collapsed into the chair, took a deep breath, and made the sign of the cross. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it would burst. She barely had the strength to stand up. She walked to her room, opened the metal memory box, and took out her son's portrait. She compared it to the face of the young man who had just left the features, the gaze, the shape of the chin. Everything matched. It was as if time had stood still in that face, and then something at the front door creaked. It wasn't a loud knock, but a brush, as if someone had left something on the other side. Beatrice went cautiously, opened the door, and looked both ways. No one. Only a folded paper on the doormat, handwritten with trembling letters. It said a single sentence: "Your son did not die." Beatrice stood motionless. The note trembled in her hands. She looked toward the next house, her neighbor Clara's, the mute woman who always seemed to know more than she said, even though she said nothing. She found her peeking from behind the curtain, her eyes moist, as if silence were escaping through her gaze, and in that instant, she knew there was no turning back. For over 30 years, Clara's silence wasn't empty. It was full of a story she was too terrified to tell. Now, that silence is finally breaking. What exactly did she witness that day of the fire? The answer is closer than Beatrice ever imagined, and it's about to change everything. But she didn't move, not yet. For years, Clara had been a silent fixture in her life, a neighbor who saw everything and said nothing. To cross that threshold now, to demand an answer from a woman who lived in silence, felt like breaking a sacred pact. Beatrice retreated from the door, the note clutched in her hand. The hope it offered was a fragile, terrifying thing. She needed a moment, just one moment, to let the possibility settle in her soul before she faced the woman who might hold the key to it all. The note was still trembling in Beatrice's hands as she sat on the bed. Your son did not die. It was as if each word was written with fire. Her breathing became heavy, as if she were short of air. She closed her eyes, and instead of the modest room she was in, another scene appeared before her, another era, another place. Snoqualmie, 50 years ago, a clean blue sky, the aroma of sweetbread and flowers, her son running among the geraniums in the yard, while James, her husband, repaired a fence. She remembered how the boy laughed, that clear, bright sound that filled the house with joy. Everything was peace. Everything was life. And then suddenly, the smoke came. She relived that moment in her mind, the wind that changed, bringing with it a smell of burning, the voices of neighbors shouting fire, the suffocating heat that enveloped her as she ran from room to room trying to save what she could. Shouts, confusion, sparks falling like fiery rain, James yelling at her to get out with the boy, and then a void. The smoke covering everything, her son's crying fading into the roar of the flames. She came out with her body singed, her hands empty. James never came out, nor did the boy. When the firefighters arrived, only ashes remained. They told her it was an accident, the gas, a moment of carelessness. But deep down, since that very night, something told her that not everything was clear, that there were hands in that fire, that it wasn't just bad luck. She opened her eyes, returning to the present. The room was in semi-darkness, but in her head, the images were still burning. She got up and took from the metal box not only the boy's photo but also the documents she had kept since then. Newspaper clippings of the fire, letters she never sent, receipts from the hospital where she had been admitted after the disaster, yellowish stained papers that spoke of a half-buried story. She stopped at a particular document, a copy of the report she had tried to file at the time, stating that her son had disappeared under strange circumstances. No one believed her. Everything burned, they told her. Nothing was left. But she knew they hadn't found a body, and a mother knows when something isn't dead. She sat down again and rested the papers on her knees. The anonymous note was, in a way, confirmation of that feeling. Someone knew, someone who had been there or had seen something. Someone who, after so many years, had decided to break the silence. She looked towards the window. Outside, the rain was finally beginning to fall. The drops hit the broken pots at the entrance. The house of Clara, the mute neighbor, had the curtains drawn, but a shadow moved behind them. Beatrice felt a shiver. That woman had watched her come and go in silence for decades. Perhaps she had seen more than she let on. She got up, took a shawl to cover herself, and put the note in her pocket. She knew she couldn't stay still. She had spent half her life in silence. Now was the time to find answers. She crossed the living room, opened the door, and went out into the alley. The rain wet the cobblestones, and the smell of wet earth brought back the memory of Snoqualmie before the fire. Everything was connected. The flowers, the song, the scar, the neighbor, the young doctor. Her heart was pounding as she approached Clara's door. She raised her hand and knocked gently. Once, twice, the old wood resonated in the alley. No one answered, but she felt movement on the other side, as if someone had frozen, listening. She knocked again, this time more firmly. The door remained closed, but now from the other side, she heard a dragging sound, a piece of furniture moving, a lock. Beatrice held her breath. A dry sound, like a bolt sliding, broke the silence, and then the door opened just a few inches, enough for a pair of eyes to look at her from within. The eyes observing her from the crack were familiar, not by the face, but by the silence. Clara, her lifelong neighbor, the mute woman who never spoke a word, who seemed to be everywhere without making a sound, who had accompanied her with her gaze for decades, was there on the other side of the door, looking at her with a mixture of pity and something harder to decipher. Guilt. Beatrice said nothing. She just waited, keeping her gaze fixed on Clara's eyes, until the door slowly opened all the way. The house was dark, silent, but not empty. There were dried flowers hanging from the ceiling, images of saints in every corner, and a smell of old incense that stuck in your throat. Clara took a step back and motioned for Beatrice to enter. She did so without hesitation. There was no need for words. She knew this night was not like the others, that finally something was going to move, that the past, once and for all, was going to speak. Clara sat across from her. In her hands, she held a wooden box. It was small, very old. Her fingers trembled as she placed it on the table. Then she got up, walked to a shelf, and took out a thin notebook covered in blue paper. She put it next to the box. Finally, she returned to her chair, looked at Beatrice, and made the sign of the cross. With a deep breath, she opened the box. Inside were objects that seemed to have no value. A golden button, a small medal with the image of Saint Benedict, a calendar page from many years ago, a lock of hair tied with red thread, and a letter folded in 4. Clara looked at Beatrice, her eyes filled with a torrent of words she could not speak. She went to an old wooden chest in the corner, a place Beatrice had never seen her open. From it, she retrieved a small, worn notebook. She opened it, and with a trembling finger, pointed to a passage she had written decades ago. Her handwriting was shaky, the ink faded. "I am sorry, Beatrice," the page read. "Fear has been my prison. I was just a girl then, working at the Snoqualmie market. I saw it all. The fire wasn't an accident. A fine lady, not from our town, was waiting. When the chaos started, she didn't run away from the house. She ran towards it. She came out with your Michael, wrapped in a blanket. He wasn't crying. He seemed stunned. She put him in a black car and drove away. I told my mother, but she told me to be silent, that these were powerful people and we were nothing. That silence has been a poison in my soul ever since." Clara then turned the page. Tucked inside was a small black and white photograph. It showed a boy of about 6 or 7, dressed in an ill-fitting suit at a church communion. His eyes were sad, lost. "I saw him once more. A year later," Clara wrote on the page below. "They brought him to St. James Cathedral. I took this photo from afar. I wanted you to have proof that he was alive." Beatrice stopped reading. Her heart was pounding in her chest, as if she couldn't breathe. Clara looked at her with moist eyes. Then she took the blue notebook, opened it, and showed her the pages. They were full of handmade drawings, but they weren't Clara's. They were a child's, with childish handwriting, muted colors, full of flowers, trees, names. On the first page, written in crooked letters, it said, "For Mrs. Clara, thank you for taking care of me when I was scared." For 50 years, she had lived with the idea that her son died in the flames. And there, in front of her, was living proof that he had survived, that someone had raised him for at least a while, that Clara, mute as she was, had kept that secret in her soul like a stone in her chest. For 50 years, she has grieved a memory. Now, she holds proof of a life. This single moment changes everything, transforming a story of loss into one of hope. But the truth is a dangerous thing, and as you're about to hear, someone is at the door who wants to keep it buried. And then, without warning, a knock came at the front door again. 3 sharp knocks. It wasn't a neighbor, it wasn't a casual visitor. Clara jumped to her feet, nervous, and put everything in a drawer. Beatrice froze. A shiver ran down her spine. The knocking came again, this time with more force, and a deep voice called out, "Clara, are you there? I'm a friend of your brother's. I was told you have something of mine, something from the past. I need to talk to you now." Clara pressed her lips together tightly and looked at Beatrice as if begging her not to move. The knocking on the door continued, harder and harder. The knocks were sharp, confident, accompanied by the voice of that unknown man who claimed to be sent by Clara's brother. Although she hadn't had contact with him in over 20 years, Beatrice didn't know whether to stay seated or run. Clara, however, stood up with precise slowness. She walked to the sideboard, took a tiny key from a vase of dried flowers, and went to the back bedroom. Before disappearing into the darkness of the hallway, she turned and pointed firmly at the table, indicating for Beatrice to wait there. Then she closed the door behind her. The house fell silent again. The man on the other side knocked one last time. Then nothing. Beatrice cautiously approached the window and saw him walk away. He walked slowly, like someone in no hurry. He was wearing an old hat, a cane, and a yellow envelope under his arm. She didn't recognize his face, but something about him gave her a chill. Minutes later, Clara returned from the room with a small box wrapped in cloth. She placed it on the table and, without a word, opened it. Inside was an old photo album, the kind with black pages and paper corners to hold the pictures. Beatrice swallowed hard. She felt that each new thing that appeared was another piece of the puzzle she had been trying to solve for half a century. Clara opened the album to the middle. The pages creaked as if they hadn't been opened in decades. There were the photos. Sepia images of a boy between 5 and 7 years old in different places Beatrice didn't recognize. The boy was smiling, but his eyes were the same. The first photos showed him with a tall woman, her face blurred, as if intentionally out of focus or cropped. In others, the boy appeared alone in elegant clothes, in what looked like a large estate, and in one of them, almost imperceptibly, Beatrice saw something that paralyzed her. The wooden tricycle, the same tricycle from the last photo she had of her son before the fire. Clara turned the page. In the next picture, the boy was wearing a plaid shirt and a small hat. He was standing in front of a church, hugging a woman with her back to the camera. The temple was unmistakable. The St. James Cathedral in Seattle. Beatrice had visited it with her husband years ago. That detail confirmed something. The boy had not only survived, he had been close all this time. "Where did you get these photos?" she asked in a choked voice. Clara opened her palm and pointed to the box. Inside was a handwritten label. "For Clara, do not open until she returns." The handwriting was masculine, shaky. "Who gave them to you?" Clara walked to a closet, took out a white envelope sealed with wax, and handed it to her. Beatrice opened it with clumsy hands. It was a handwritten letter in barely legible blue ink. It had no return address, but the contents spoke for itself. "Mrs. Beatrice, you don't know me, but I knew your husband, James. I worked with him in Snoqualmie before the fire. I know what happened that day. I saw things that forced me to be silent for many years, but I can't anymore. The boy was taken by a woman who had power, money, and connections in Seattle. She passed him off as an orphan. They gave him up for illegal adoption. I can't tell you her name yet, but he is alive, very close, closer than you think." Beatrice felt the world go blurry. She clung to the table. The letter slowly fell from her hands. Clara held her arm before she could collapse. It wasn't just hope she felt. It was fear. Fear of believing and losing again. Fear of getting her hopes up and being broken once more. "Is he alive?" she asked, as if she still needed to hear it out loud, even though no one could say it with words. Clara didn't answer. She just nodded with tears in her eyes. Beatrice clenched her jaw, took a deep breath, and for the first time in many years, she felt something she had forgotten: the need to fight. But before she could say anything more, the doorbell rang again. This time it wasn't knocks, it was the chime. And with the chime, a firm, young, male voice. "Good evening, Clara. I'm Ethan. I wanted to talk to you for a moment, if it's not too much trouble." The name Ethan echoed at the door like contained thunder. Beatrice felt the blood stop in her veins. Clara, who still had the album in her hands, turned her head sharply towards her. They both froze. "Are you all right?" Ethan insisted from the other side in a gentle voice. "I don't want to intrude. I just need to understand something that has been unsettling me for days." Beatrice slowly stood up, but Clara extended her arm and stopped her firmly. With her other hand, she motioned for her to gather everything: the letter, the lock of hair, the photos. Everything had to go back in the box. They did it in silence, barely breathing. When Clara was sure there was no trace of the past on the table, she went to the door. She opened it cautiously, showing only her face. Ethan was there, soaked by the fine drizzle falling from the sky. He had an expression of exhaustion in his eyes, but also of need, a need to know. "Sorry," he said. "I was told you've lived here for many years, and you know Mrs. Beatrice, right?" Clara nodded slowly. "I need to ask you a question," Ethan continued without raising his voice. "Something no one has wanted to answer. Do you know who the woman who helped me in the square that day was? Do you know anything about her?" Clara looked at him for a long time, as if she wanted to say 1,000 things and couldn't. Then she looked inside, towards Beatrice, who was hiding in the dining room doorway. Their eyes met in the thickest silence of the night. Clara hesitated, but finally nodded. Then she opened the door wider and, with a gesture, invited the young man in. Ethan hesitated for just a few seconds and crossed the threshold. He took off his wet hat, wiped his glasses with the sleeve of his coat, and greeted her respectfully. Upon seeing Beatrice, his face lit up with a mixture of relief and tenderness. She, on the other hand, maintained her composure, although inside her heart wanted to leap out of her chest. "I didn't know you and Mrs. Clara were friends," Ethan said. Beatrice barely smiled. "Neighbors don't need to speak to know each other," she replied. "The years teach us to read with our eyes, not with words." They sat down. Ethan apologized for the hour, but said he couldn't wait any longer. He had been having trouble sleeping since he spoke with her. There was something in her voice, in the way she looked at him, that stirred up memories he didn't even know he had. Fragments of songs, colors, smells, things that had no logical explanation. "I want to know about myself," he said suddenly, direct, without beating around the bush. "Where do I really come from? What is being hidden? No one will tell me, and I think you two know more than you're letting on." Beatrice closed her eyes. It was as if destiny itself were demanding that she break her silence. It wasn't a time for theories, it was a time to seek truths, but she still had no solid proof. The only thing she could offer was a story and hope. 50 years ago, she began, I lived in Snoqualmie, in a house that now only exists in my memory. I had a son, his name was Michael James. If he were alive today, he would be about your age. Ethan frowned, confused. He disappeared in a fire, Beatrice said, her voice breaking. But they never found his body. I always knew he was alive. I felt it the way mothers feel things. No one believed me. They called me crazy, but someone took him out of that house and gave him to another family. Clara watched in silence. Ethan swallowed hard. Are you saying that? Beatrice interrupted him firmly. I'm not asserting anything, but I am saying that if you feel in your heart that something doesn't fit in your story, then maybe what you're missing isn't logic, it's memory. Ethan looked down, took a photo from his wallet, an old image of him as a child with a young, elegant woman he never knew. He never had a clear story about her. Sharon never wanted to talk about the past. This woman? He asked, holding the photo out to Beatrice. She took the image. Her face changed completely. It wasn't because of the woman, it was because of what was behind her. A stone fountain and a crooked tree. The same tree she had in her garden in Snoqualmie, the same one James had planted with his father when he was 4 years old. She closed her eyes. It was too much of a coincidence, too much to keep calling it chance. But before she could say it out loud, someone knocked on the door again. This time it wasn't Ethan or the man with the cane. It was a female voice, deep, confident. Clara, Beatrice, we need to talk. And I'm not leaving until we do. The silence shattered like glass. That voice, confident, firm, loaded with authority, did not belong to a common neighbor or a curious visitor. Beatrice knew it as soon as she heard that tone. A long time had passed, but certain tones, certain ways of speaking, leave a mark on the memory. Clara slowly turned towards the door. Her eyes were wide open, as if she recognized the voice even before her lips formed a sound. Ethan stood up, bewildered. Who? He managed to say. Beatrice didn't answer. She walked to the entrance with a measured slowness, as someone who is not afraid, but without respect. She opened the door cautiously. Outside, under the faint light of the street lamp, stood a woman with white hair, carefully pulled back, dressed in a dark shawl and a blouse embroidered with colorful flowers. Her hands were wrinkled but firm, and her eyes were two burning coals, full of a story that had not yet been told. Good evening, the woman said without moving from the threshold. My name is Ruth, and I've come to say what I can no longer keep silent. Beatrice took a step back. Clara did too. No one said anything. The woman entered confidently and sat down without asking permission in the chair by the wall. She took out a cloth bag and from it an old photo. She placed it on the table. I knew your son, she said, looking directly at Beatrice. Michael James. Beatrice felt the world stop. You. How? I worked at the Snoqualmie market, Ruth interrupted in a deep voice. I sold flowers, like you. I saw him many times running between the stalls with his dad, and I was there the day of the fire too. I saw the woman who took him. Ethan was sitting with a pale face. He listened to everything without interrupting, as if his body were there, but his soul were floating on another plane. "What woman?" he asked, unable to contain himself. Ruth looked at him for a long time before answering. "A lady who wasn't from around there. She had a car, a driver, fine clothes. It wasn't common. She was standing in front of the bakery when it all started. When we saw the smoke, everyone ran. She didn't. She went into the house as if she knew what she was looking for. She came out with the boy wrapped in a blanket. She took him away in silence. No one stopped her. Everyone was in chaos. No one paid attention. But I did. I saw her, and I've remembered her every night since then." Clara let out a mute sob. Beatrice put her hands to her face. Ruth took her hand firmly. "You weren't crazy. It wasn't your fault. They took him from you." "Why did you wait so long?" Beatrice asked, her voice breaking. "Why didn't you say anything?" Ruth looked down. Her fingers caressed the edge of the photo as if it were an old wound. "Because I was afraid. That woman wasn't alone. She was powerful. No one wanted to mess with her. I was poor, alone, with no protection. Who would have believed me? But now that I saw that boy in the square, now that I've heard the rumors, I know it's him. I knew it as soon as I saw his eyes." Everyone turned to Ethan. He didn't know what to say. His heart was pounding, as if his body were responding to a truth his mind couldn't yet process. "Where did they take him?" Beatrice whispered. "Do you know anything else?" Ruth shook her head. "Only that the woman came back 2 weeks later, but without the boy. She bought flowers at my stall, looked at me as if she knew that I knew, and never came back." Beatrice leaned back in her chair, drained of strength. Clara took out the boy's medal and placed it on the table next to the photo. Ruth looked at it. "That medal," she whispered. "He was wearing it on a chain the day of the fire. I found it at my door," Beatrice said. Ethan swallowed hard, stood up. "I have one just like it," he said, taking something from his wallet. "I don't know why, but I've always had it. My adoptive mother gave it to me when I was a child. She said it was mine since I was a baby." Beatrice stood up. The two medals were identical. They placed them side by side. Ruth looked at them, closed her eyes, and said something everyone knew but no one dared to utter. "He is your son." And there it is. The words that have hung unspoken in the air for 50 years, finally given voice. This isn't just a theory anymore. It's a truth confirmed by a simple piece of silver, a truth that reconnects a mother and her long-lost son. You would think the universe would grant them a moment of peace to absorb this miracle. But the world has other plans. Beatrice said nothing, just looked at him. She looked at him as if she were seeing through time, as if every wrinkle, every line on his face had been carved just to arrive at this moment. Ethan, trembling, held her gaze and didn't look away. But before he could say a word, thunder rumbled in the sky. The lights in the house flickered, and the door knocked again. "Mrs. Beatrice, you have to come out. Something happened at the square. You have to come now." Beatrice felt her whole body tense upon hearing the desperate call from the street. The door was still ajar from Ruth's visit, and the caller's voice seeped in with the urgency of an unexpected storm. "Mrs. Beatrice, the flower lady, there's a serious problem at the square. You have to come." Ethan was the first to react. He stood up from his chair and walked to the door, where a young man, soaked by the rain and out of breath, waited anxiously. "What happened?" he asked. "Someone knocked over your stand, doctor. The flowers are all over the ground, the vases are broken, and people are saying ugly things that she provoked that rich woman, that she was looking for a fight. But it's not true. We all know Mrs. Beatrice isn't like that. And people are recording, telling lies." Beatrice didn't need to hear more. She covered herself with her shawl and, without a word, went out into the drizzle, leaving behind Ethan, Clara, and Ruth, who looked at each other with a mixture of helplessness and fear. The walk to the square was short, but each step felt heavy, as if she were carrying half a century on her shoulders. The wet streets glistened under the lamplight, and the air smelled of mud, tension, of something about to break. When she arrived, the first thing she saw was her wooden bench overturned, flowers scattered on the ground, buckets knocked over, the tarp torn. A group of people, mostly onlookers, surrounded the place. Some muttered, others recorded with their cell phones. And there, in the middle of it all, with a poorly concealed smile on her face, was Kimberly Price, an upper-class woman, a downtown resident, and a close friend of Sharon Montgomery. "Well, look who's here," Kimberly said, crossing her arms. The star of the show. Beatrice didn't respond. She walked with dignity through the murmurs, bending down to pick up, one by one, the flowers that could still be saved. A white lily, a torn rose, a carnation broken in half. The crowd began to fall silent. The way she moved, without haste, without lowering her head, was more unsettling than any shout. Ethan arrived running seconds later. "This is an outrage," he shouted, pushing aside those who stood in his way. "Who would dare do something like this?" "Don't exaggerate, Doctor," Kimberly intervened. "It was just an accident. No one wanted to harm the lady. But you know how she is. She gives dirty looks, she provokes. She sticks her nose where it doesn't belong." Beatrice stood up, her eyes fixed on her. "This isn't the first time I've been hit without using hands," she said in a firm voice. "But words leave marks too, and there are marks that don't heal." The tension grew. The spectators, previously entertained, began to change their expressions. Some lowered their cell phones, others looked away. The rain continued to fall as if the sky also felt like crying. "We don't need more conflict," Ethan intervened, controlling his tone. "This lady is respected by everyone in this neighborhood, and she deserves respect." Kimberly, uncomfortable, turned around and left without answering, knowing that any more words would only make her look worse. Beatrice took a deep breath. She knelt down again to pick up what was left. Then Ethan knelt beside her. "Let me help you." She looked at him for a long moment, as if seeing him for the first time, as if in the midst of the chaos, something inside her finally clicked into place. She watched him bend down, gently pick up a fallen flower, and without realizing it, he exposed his arm. A fine scar, just on the inside of his elbow, caught her attention. She said nothing, just looked at it. For a few seconds, the sound of the rain disappeared. That scar, that way of bending down, that way of touching the flower as if it were a treasure, a memory came back like a whip. Her son, as a child, after a fall, crying over an identical wound, right in the same place, and her singing a melody to him while she treated it. Beatrice swallowed. "That scar, where is it from?" Ethan, surprised by the question, looked at it. "I don't know. I've always had it. Since I was a kid." Sharon said it was a birthmark or from some accident I don't remember. She didn't answer, just nodded silently, the flower in her hands. The square began to empty. People gradually left. Ruth and Clara watched from the corner without intervening. That night, after putting away what little was left of her stand, Beatrice returned home with a certainty. The heart that had been silent for years was now screaming, a truth that could no longer be ignored. And as she hung her shawl behind the door, she heard hurried footsteps approaching down the street. A voice called her from outside. Mrs. Beatrice, wait. It's me. I have something you need to see, and it can't wait until tomorrow." Beatrice recognized the voice even before seeing the face. It was Megan, the daughter of Walter, the neighborhood baker. She was just over 50, but still had the same youthful energy. As a child, she had run among the market stalls with Beatrice and her son. Now she was the one standing there, soaked, breathing heavily, and with a pale face. "Mrs. Beatrice," she said, holding onto the doorframe. "I went to see my Aunt Rose, the one who lives in San Pedro. She showed me some old photos from a church event, and your son is in one of them. Well, I don't know if it's him, but it's either him or someone identical. You have to see it." Beatrice didn't react immediately. Ethan, who was still inside the house, approached upon hearing the conversation. "A photo?" he asked. Megan nodded vigorously. "Yes, doctor. A black and white one, very clear. He's at a church communion from his childhood. The boy is in a suit next to an unknown family, but he doesn't look happy, and I swear on my mother's memory, it's the same boy Beatrice used to hold hands with when I was 5 years old. The same one." Megan's words shook Beatrice to her core. The image of that communion, of the boy dressed in clothes that didn't belong to him, tore her apart inside. How could it be that after all this time, her son's face kept appearing in forgotten fragments of others' memories? "Where's that photo?" she asked urgently. "My aunt lent it to me. It's at my house." "Come on, it's not far." Without hesitation, Beatrice took her shawl and went out into the drizzle. Ethan followed her, and behind them, at a slow pace, went Clara like a faithful shadow. Megan walked ahead, making her way through the puddles. It took them no more than 10 minutes to reach the small, mustard-colored house. Upon entering, the warmth inside contrasted with the dampness outside. Megan went straight to a shelf and took out a plastic envelope. From it, she extracted several photos until she found the one she was looking for. She placed it on the table under the lamp. The silence that followed was almost sacred. There was the boy in a suit, his hair combed with a side part, a poorly tied bow tie, and sad eyes. He wasn't looking at the camera. He had a paper flower on his lapel, and behind him, a man and a woman with harsh expressions. Beatrice felt her chest breaking, not because of the clothes or the place, but because of the eyes. Those eyes were his. Clara covered her face, holding back tears. Ethan leaned in, observed the boy's face in detail. The jaw, the shape of the cheekbones, the downcast gaze. He took out a photo of himself as a child and placed it next to the old image. The resemblance was so obvious it was needless to speak. Megan put a hand to her mouth. "See? I knew it. I'm not crazy." Beatrice caressed the photo with her fingertips. She was about to break, but this time not from sadness, but from a mixture of pain, hope, and something she couldn't name. Something that felt too much like the love she had kept silent for years. "And those people, the ones with him?" Ethan asked. "I don't know," Megan replied. "My aunt said they were very wealthy people, that they came only once, rented out the entire church for the ceremony, and then disappeared. They were never heard from again. Did they mention a name?" "Just a last name, Montgomery. And there it is, the one word that connects a stolen child to the woman who raised him." In that single moment, Ethan's entire world tilts on its axis, and for Beatrice, a lifetime of vague feelings crystallizes into a horrifying certainty. The enemy she's been searching for has been hiding in plain sight. The word fell like a bucket of ice water in the middle of the room. Beatrice closed her eyes. Ethan stood frozen. Clara slowly turned towards him. "Montgomery," he repeated breathlessly. My mother is Sharon Montgomery." The silence that followed lasted only a second, but it seemed eternal. "Then," Beatrice whispered, her voice barely audible, "then it's possible. It's possible that it's you. Do you think that?" "I don't think it," she said with tears in her eyes. "I feel it, here in my chest, in my gut, as only a mother can feel." Ethan lowered his head. He felt dizzy, as if the whole world were swaying beneath his feet. Everything he had known as his life could be built on a lie. But before he could say anything more, they heard a loud bang on the front door. A hard knock, a second, a third, then a voice. "Beatrice Calderon, we know you're in there. Come out now. We don't want to hurt you, but if you don't open this door, we won't be responsible." The banging on the door echoed again, louder than before. Megan jumped back. Clara stood motionless, her hands trembling. Ethan looked at Beatrice, seeking a sign of what to do. She, however, took a deep breath and walked to the entrance. She opened it carefully, but only a little. Outside, there were no uniforms or curious neighbors. It was a messenger with an envelope in his hand. "This is for Mrs. Beatrice Calderon," he said without looking up. "I was told to deliver it to you personally. I don't know anything else." Beatrice took the envelope, closed the door immediately, and watched the messenger walk away in the rain. The name written in blue ink on the front was unmistakable. Sharon Montgomery. She returned inside, her heart in her throat. Everyone watched her expectantly. She sat at the table, opened the envelope, and took out a letter and a separate folded sheet. The letter had elegant, firm handwriting, very different from the anonymous notes. She began to read it in a low voice, but the words were so heavy that each sentence felt like a blow. "Beatrice Calderon, I know who you are. and I know what you're looking for. You should leave everything alone. But since you insist on stirring up the past, here is a piece of the truth, not all of it, just what I dare to give you." The letter continued. "My mother, Margaret Montgomery, did things that I witnessed and was complicit in out of fear. Among those things is a baby that did not belong to her, and yet arrived at our house as if it were a trophy. They called him an adopted son, but there were never real papers, no judges, no certificates, just money, a lot of money, and silences. I was young. I thought it would resolve itself one day. It never did. And today, we all carry that shadow." Beatrice put her hand to her mouth. Clara was crying silently. Ethan stood, rigid, looking at the blank sheet of paper next to the letter. He took it and unfolded it. It was a photocopy of an old receipt. Payment for medical services. Snoqualmie Hospital, June 1974. Below, in handwritten script, it read, "Infant delivered." Ethan sat down as if his legs had failed him. His fingers traced the word infant over and over. This can't be," he murmured. Beatrice looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Yes, it can. Yes, it is." The letter ended with a sentence that chilled the blood. "Don't look for me. Don't call me. Don't blame me. We each carry our own cross. But if you keep searching, know that there are people willing to do anything to keep this story from coming to light." The silence in the room became thick. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast. Megan looked at everyone, unsure whether to stay or run. Ruth, from the corner, crossed herself again and again, murmuring prayers. Ethan clenched the paper in his fists. What his whole life had felt like a nameless void was now transforming into an abyss filled with dirty truths. His adoptive mother was part of something much darker than he had ever imagined. "I need to see her," he said suddenly. "I need her to say it to my face." Beatrice stood up and took his hand. Both of their skins were trembling. "Wait," she whispered. "If you go now, you won't come back the same." But Ethan wasn't listening. He put on his coat and walked towards the door. Clara tried to stop him, but he left anyway. His footsteps echoed in the hallway like a war drum. Beatrice, still with the letter in her hand, followed him to the threshold but stood motionless. She knew the story had just crossed a point of no return. She knew that what Ethan was about to discover could either break him or save him, but there was no turning back. A distant thunderclap shook the air, and at that very moment, the house's landline phone rang. Beatrice looked at it. The old white phone, forgotten in a corner, hardly ever rang. With trembling hands, she picked up the receiver. "Beatrice Calderon?" a male voice asked on the other end. "I need to talk to you. I'm a doctor from Snoqualmie Hospital. I witnessed something no one knows, and I can't keep quiet any longer. But we must meet in person. Tonight." The line went dead before she could respond. The sound of the dial tone still echoed in Beatrice's mind as the rain stopped falling on the roof. Ethan, who had left with Sharon's letter in his hands, was walking quickly toward his apartment. His face was hardened, and his gaze was lost. The words "purchased baby and infant" delivered repeated like an echo that hurt more than any wound. When he arrived, he didn't turn on the light. He slumped into a chair, breathing deeply, and took out the copy of his birth certificate from the drawer where he kept his documents. He had seen it 1,000 times, but never with these eyes. The date, the signature, the seal, everything seemed correct. However, that night, with Sharon's letter on the table, every detail screamed lie. He took out his old computer, which he rarely used, and began searching for information about the hospital where he was supposedly born. Street, Joseph's Clinic, Snoqualmie, the certificate said. He typed and typed. The result left him cold. That clinic had closed in 1973. He was born in 1974, a year after it closed. He jumped up, opened another drawer, and found the certified copy he kept for legal matters. He held it up to the light. There was something odd about the seal, as if it had been added on top of another one. He took his wallet and pulled out the medal he always carried. He clenched it in his fist until his knuckles turned white. "Who am I then?" he whispered. The words came out broken. He ran his hands over his face, and without knowing why, began to hum a melody. It was the same melody that had come out on its own in the square, the one that had made Beatrice cry without him understanding why. As he hummed, a flash appeared in his mind. A patio with geraniums, a wooden tricycle, a woman in a shawl singing to him to stop crying. He didn't know where that memory came from. He had never been there, yet it felt like his own. He stood up again. He needed answers. He grabbed his coat and headed for the county clerk's office. He knew it would be closed at that hour, but he didn't care. He had to be there at dawn to request access to the old records, the real files. He knew he wouldn't sleep. As he walked, the streets of Seattle seemed darker than ever. He passed by the neighborhood church and stopped for a moment. Inside, a group of elderly women were praying the rosary. The murmur of their prayers shook him. He knelt in the nearest pew, not to pray, but to breathe, to not lose control, to order the chaos in his mind. As he left, well after midnight, he saw a tall man leaning against a post in the distance. He wore a hat and carried a cane. It was the same messenger who had brought the letter to Beatrice. He recognized him by his profile. The man lit a cigarette, and noticing Ethan looking at him, turned and walked away without a word, disappearing into the narrow streets. That image gave him a shiver. Something very big was moving around him. It wasn't just old papers, it was living people, watching, manipulating. At dawn, he entered the county clerk's office as soon as the doors opened. He introduced himself as a doctor, a citizen, an adopted son searching for his origins. They showed him to a small room filled with files and thick ledgers. A young employee checked the computer and then a dusty index. He looked for Ethan's certificate in the 1974 books. The page wasn't there. There was a skip in the numbering. The young man frowned. "That's strange," he said. "It should be here, but it's not. The only thing here is a death certificate for an unidentified woman on the same day you were supposedly born. Nothing else." Ethan felt his stomach clench. "Can I see that certificate?" The employee hesitated but finally showed it to him. It was an old form with faded ink. It didn't list a name, only unidentified female. Transfer from Snoqualmie to Seattle. Died during childbirth. Below was the signature of a doctor Ethan didn't know. "This makes no sense," he muttered. The young employee looked at him with compassion. Sometimes illegal adoptions were covered up like this. They erased records, invented others. My grandmother used to tell me stories like that from the 72nds. It was more common than you think. Ethan put his hands to his head. The missing piece was starting to fit together cruelly. He had not only been adopted without papers, his origin had been erased. Someone powerful had paid for that. And that someone was linked to the Montgomery family. He looked at his hands, a doctor's hands, steady and skilled. For his entire life, he had defined himself by his profession, by the future he was building. Now, for the first time, he was forced to look back at a past that wasn't his. Every memory, every holiday, every story Sharon had told him was now tainted. He wasn't just a man without a true past. He was a man living in someone else's fabricated one. The emptiness he'd occasionally felt was not just a feeling. It was the gaping hole where a boy named Michael James Calderon should have been. He left the county clerk's office with trembling hands. The sun was just beginning to light up the city. He had the feeling someone was following him. He turned around several times but saw no one. He quickened his pace, tucking the papers into his coat. When he turned the corner of the market street, he saw the figure of Beatrice in the distance, walking towards him with a determined step, an envelope in her hand. It seemed she had been up all night. She stopped in front of him. "We have to go together," she said without preamble. "The doctor from Snoqualmie Hospital called me last night. He says he knows what happened. He says he signed your birth certificate and wants to talk to you too." Ethan's heart was pounding like a drum in his chest. He wasn't ready, but he knew he couldn't keep running. "Let's go," he said. They got on the first bus that would take them to Snoqualmie. The road wound through green hills and cold air. Neither spoke for a long time. They just glanced at each other, recognizing themselves in shared silences. As the bus began to descend into the valley, the silhouette of the old hospital appeared in the distance, gray, enormous, with boarded-up windows, like a sleeping giant. Beatrice clutched the envelope in her hands tightly. Ethan closed his eyes and took a deep breath. When they got off the bus, a man in a white coat was waiting for them at the entrance. He had gray hair, a stooped back, and tired eyes, the eyes of someone who has carried secrets for too long. "Mrs. Beatrice, Dr. Ethan," he said, looking at them both. "Come in. I'll tell you everything. But inside, we're not safe out here." The walls of the old Snoqualmie Hospital gave off a smell of dampness and neglect that clung to your clothes, but inside the small office where the retired doctor awaited them, the atmosphere was different. There was something denser than dust, the weight of years, of secrets, of things that should never have happened. The doctor's name was Elias Peterson. His hands trembled slightly as he poured 2 cups of coffee into time-stained styrofoam cups. "I've carried this in my soul for over 40 years, he finally said as he sat down across from Beatrice and Ethan. "You don't know me, but I was here the day of the fire. I received your husband's body, and I also signed the fake birth certificate that built this whole lie." Beatrice looked down. Ethan gritted his teeth. "Why did you do it?" he asked. The doctor sighed. "Because I had no choice. I received threats. They showed me pictures of my daughter leaving school. It was a time when you couldn't ask too many questions, and the family behind all this was powerful. It was the Montgomerys. I didn't know their names at first, but then I recognized her. Sharon, Beatrice said. Right? Her mother, Margaret Montgomery. A woman who wouldn't look anyone in the eye because she believed the world should bow down to her. She was the one who organized everything. The fire, the boy's disappearance, the illegal adoption, and the silence of all of us who worked here. Ethan swallowed hard. And what happened to the boy? They kept him hidden for weeks. We treated him in the private wing of the hospital. He had a minor burn on his arm and was dehydrated. He cried all the time, but then he just disappeared. They forced me to sign a birth certificate with a false date in the name of a mother who never existed. It was all a setup. Beatrice slowly took a small object from her purse. She placed it on the table. It was a tiny, tarnished silver ring with the initials EM engraved inside. The doctor looked at it and nodded. They put that ring on him the day he left the hospital. It was one of the nurse's ideas. She said that way, if anyone ever found him, they could know who he was. "I kept it for years," Beatrice said, her voice breaking. "I found it days after the fire in a box the firefighters rescued. I never knew if it was a sign of life or death." Ethan reached out his hand, took the ring, felt a shiver, and without understanding why, placed it on the ring finger of his right hand. It fit perfectly. "Is there anything else?" Elias said, opening his desk drawer. "I've kept this sheet for over 4 decades. I never had the courage to destroy it. It's the original draft of the birth certificate with your real name, Michael James Calderon." Beatrice covered her mouth. Ethan looked at her in shock. The doctor slid the paper towards them. It was yellowed, with coffee stains on the corners and wrinkled edges, but it was clear. There, written, was the boy's full name and his biological mother's, Beatrice Calderon Ramirez. This is the moment. After a lifetime of being called crazy, of grieving a son no one believed was alive, here is the proof in black and white. It's more than just a name on a piece of paper. It is a stolen identity, finally returned. Stay with us, because knowing the truth is one thing, but claiming it is another battle entirely. "I am," Ethan murmured, barely breathing. "I am him." Beatrice was crying silently. She made no scene. She didn't scream. She just placed a hand on Ethan's, as if to make sure it wasn't a dream. He didn't pull away. On the contrary, he closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life felt what it was to have roots, to feel that he came from somewhere, that he had a name before he was adopted, before he was used as a family secret. "What's left now," the doctor said in a low voice, "is to confront those who hid everything." Ethan nodded, but before leaving he asked, "Was anyone else involved?" Elias hesitated. Then he stood up, went to a shelf, and took out a sealed envelope. "A nurse who worked with us gave this to me. She disappeared. Later, she asked me to keep it until the truth was ready to be told. I haven't opened it, but if you've come this far, it's because you're ready." Ethan took the envelope. It was heavy. He put it inside his coat, without opening it yet. "Thank you, doctor," Beatrice said, wiping her tears. "Don't thank me," he replied. "I failed when courage was needed most. At least now, I have a chance to help mend something." They left the hospital with the sun already high in the sky. The cool, snow-qualmy wind blew strongly, as if wanting to sweep away the years of lies that had stained that place. On the way back on the bus, Ethan said nothing, just held the envelope in his lap, as if it were a bomb about to explode. Beatrice, sitting beside him, didn't speak either, just looked at him from time to time, like someone watching a person who has finally returned from the abyss. And as they were about to arrive in Seattle, Ethan turned his face to her and asked in a low voice, "Do you think Sharon knew all this from the beginning?" Beatrice took a moment to respond. Then she nodded. Not only did she know, she allowed it. Ethan clenched his fists, and without another word, took out his cell phone, found Sharon's contact, and dialed. The phone rang 3 times. "Ethan," she answered in a nervous tone. "We need to talk," he said in a firm voice. "But this time, you're going to tell me the whole truth, even if it's the last thing you do." Beatrice turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. Ethan remained standing with the envelope still in his hands. Sharon Montgomery stopped 2 steps from the entrance. She wore an expensive dark coat, her lips pressed together, but her gaze was no longer the same. She was agitated, scared. "Doctor." Elias Peterson recognized her instantly. Sooner or later, she was going to show up, he said, not hiding his contempt. "Doctor," Sharon replied with a hint of false courtesy, "you shouldn't be involved in this. You already got your part, and you already got yours," he answered sternly. "But now there are things that can no longer be covered up." Sharon approached Ethan. The air between them grew thick. "My love," she said in an almost maternal tone. "Listen to me. That thing in your hands, don't open it. Not everything one wants to know is good for the heart." Ethan slowly lowered the envelope, not because he believed her, but because he didn't want her to destroy it with her hands. He put it in the inner pocket of his coat and then spoke without raising his voice. "You knew everything from the beginning. You knew who I was. You knew where I came from. Why did you lie to me?" Sharon narrowed her eyes. The mask of a devoted mother was cracking. "I protected you," she replied. "From the moment you came to me, I was the only one who gave you a last name, a home, a future. That's a lie." "Yes," Beatrice intervened forcefully. "You gave him everything except the truth." Sharon looked at her with hatred. "And what were you going to give him?" "Withered flowers, stale bread, and cold water. I raised him as my own because you disappeared." "Because you took him from me," Beatrice shouted, taking a step toward her. "Because your mother orchestrated everything to take what wasn't hers. Or are you going to deny that too?" Sharon looked down for the first time, and then, as if something inside her collapsed, she sat on the nearest gurney. For a few seconds, she seemed defeated. "I was young," she said, almost in a whisper. "I had no choice. My mother forced me to stay quiet. She told me if I spoke, she would destroy us both. And when they took your son from you, I did nothing. I just received him. I saw him arrive wrapped in a blanket, his eyes full of fear, and I couldn't. I didn't know what to do." Ethan stood there, looking at her as one looks at a stranger. His mother, the woman who taught him to read, to ride a bike, to trust no one, was also the woman who had built his life on a lie. "Why did you never tell me?" "Because I was afraid you would hate me. And now you hate me for finding out," he replied. Sharon looked at him with tears she didn't know were of remorse or loss. "No," she whispered. "I'm just afraid of losing you." Ethan took a deep breath, took the envelope out of his coat, and held it in his hands. He said nothing. Silence fell again like a tombstone on everyone. The doctor remained firm in his corner. Beatrice was barely breathing. Then, without warning, Ethan opened the envelope. Inside were 3 things. A copy of the original file of the boy admitted to the hospital with minor burns. A photograph showing a sleeping child on a gurney with a medal hanging from his neck, and a handwritten sheet signed by the same nurse who had alerted Dr. Elias years ago. The letter was clear. The boy named Michael James was admitted without legal registration. He was taken from the hospital on the night of the 14th of June, 1974, by a woman with the last name Montgomery. Payment was in cash. No one else at the hospital ever heard from him again. Attached is a copy of the report I kept for fear of reprisals. This truth must be known. Ethan sat down. He no longer felt anger or pity. He felt something deeper, a painful peace, as if he could finally put a name to everything he had felt since childhood. Beatrice approached and knelt before him. "I used to sing you a song when you were little," she said in a low voice. "You don't remember it, but it's in your blood. Can I sing it to you?" He nodded, his eyes full of water. Beatrice took his hand, looked into his eyes, and began to sing the melody that had slept among ashes for half a century. And as she sang, Ethan, without understanding how, hummed the melody with her, as if his soul had kept it secret all these years. Sharon stood up, her gaze lowered, and without another word, she walked out the door. She didn't apologize, she didn't scream, she didn't look back. And when the last chord of the song died in the air, "Doctor," Elias said in a dry voice, "there's still something missing, and it's not here, it's in Seattle. There's a name you haven't heard yet, who was key in all of this. A woman who pretended to be Beatrice's close friend and who worked with the Montgomerys from before the fire." Ethan frowned. "Who?" The doctor looked at him gravely. "Veronica Hayes." Sharon closed the door of the old hospital again without looking back. She walked quickly, almost tripping over her own steps, as if fleeing the past could change what she had just heard. There was no shadow, word, or lie that could cover what Ethan had discovered. The truth had been revealed, and it was irreversible. She got into her SUV, her hands trembling. She started the engine without knowing where to go. For the first time in many years, her power, her influence, her last name were useless. Ethan no longer looked at her the same way. He was no longer her son. He was the son of the woman they had made disappear, the son of the most painful mistake of her life. She took her cell phone, hesitated, looked for her personal lawyer's contact, but didn't call him. Instead, she dialed another number, one she hadn't used in decades. "Hello? It's me," Sharon said in a dry voice. An uncomfortable silence crossed the line. "I told you not to call me again. I don't care. This is falling apart. Ethan knows everything. Beatrice, too." The doctor talked. "I have no control anymore. And what do you want me to do? You helped my mother organize this. Don't pretend now. You knew everything." The voice on the other end fell silent. Then, in a slow tone, it replied, "I followed orders. But if you think I'm going down with you, you're mistaken." Sharon gritted her teeth. "You're not doing this to me. Not to me. You did this. You, not your mother. You were the one who decided to stay quiet, the one who accepted the child. Don't call me again." The call ended. Sharon threw the cell phone onto the passenger seat. Her fingers tightened on the steering wheel. Fear was no longer a fleeting sensation. It was a presence breathing down her neck, enveloping her on every street she passed. There was no longer a way to silence mouths or buy truths. What remained was to face the inevitable. Meanwhile, Beatrice and Ethan were returning to Seattle, their hearts in turmoil. On the bus, neither spoke. The envelope with the nurse's letter and the original certificate rested between them like a freshly opened wound. When they got off, they said goodbye to Dr. Elias, who gave them a copy of the full report, assuring them he was willing to testify if the time came. At 80 years old, he said, he no longer feared anything, not even the Montgomerys. Beatrice and Ethan walked through the downtown streets in silence. When they reached the house, they found Clara sitting by the door, waiting for them with an anxious expression. In her hands, she held an open envelope. "It arrived an hour ago," she wrote on a sheet she showed them. "A woman with a hat left it. She wouldn't give her name, but I recognized her. It's Veronica." Ethan read the letter. It was brief. "Don't trust anyone. What's coming is worse than what you already know. There are names that haven't been mentioned yet. If you really want to know who paid for the silence, look in the old house in Snoqualmie, in the closet of the back room, behind the mirror. No one signed it." Beatrice felt her heart lurch. The closet, that room in ruins where she and her husband used to sleep before the fire. If anything had survived there, buried among the ashes, it had to be important. "Let's go?" Ethan asked. She nodded. They prepared for the trip back to Snoqualmie again. There was no time to lose. They felt the circle was closing, that everything hidden was coming to light, pushed by forces they didn't even understand. But on the other side of the city, Sharon was not sleeping. She watched the night horizon from her house's terrace. In her hands she held a small vial. Inside, a silver medal with the initials EM, the same one she had taken from the boy's neck when she received him at the mansion so many years ago. She pressed it to her chest and in a low voice, barely a murmur, said, "I loved him too." Her eyes filled with tears, but the crying didn't erase what she had done. That night, while Seattle slept, in the heart of Snoqualmie, a hooded figure crossed the ruins of Beatrice's old house. They entered through a broken window with soft steps and went straight to the back room. In front of the dusty mirror of the closet, they began to move the rotten wood. They were looking for something, and they found it. A hidden compartment. They took out a package wrapped in cloth. They opened it just a few centimeters, smiled with satisfaction, and disappeared into the darkness. Beatrice and Ethan arrived at the old house in Snoqualmie at dawn the next day. The sky was covered by a thick layer of gray clouds that foreshadowed a storm, but that didn't stop them. They got off the bus without a word and walked in silence down the cobblestone street. The air smelled of damp earth, as if history itself was waiting to reveal itself to them. The house seemed smaller than in Beatrice's memories, but it retained the same essence. The cracked walls, the wooden gate with rusty hinges, and the broken pots by the entrance. They pushed the door, which creaked as if waking from a long slumber. They walked down the hallway to the back room. Beatrice hesitated to enter. It was the room she shared with James, her husband, and their son before the fire. The walls were blackened with smoke from a past that hadn't completely disappeared. "There," she said, pointing to the built-in closet. Behind the mirror, Ethan approached. He carefully moved the large mirror that covered part of the wall. Behind it, as the anonymous letter had said, was a loose wooden board. He removed it with difficulty. On the other side, in a hidden hollow, he found a box wrapped in cloth. It wasn't large, but it was heavier than he expected. He placed it on the dust-covered bed. He opened it. Inside, the first thing they saw was a bundle of letters tied with a red ribbon, then a folder with official papers, and a black and white photograph. And finally, a loose sheet, a falsified birth certificate that said Ethan was born to a woman named Alice Johnson in a rural clinic that never existed. Beatrice took one of the letters. It was written by James, her husband. With trembling hands, she read aloud, "Beatrice, if you're reading this, it means you managed to come back. I don't know what will have happened to me, but if you manage to get our son back, this truth will help you defend him. The day before the fire, I received a threat. They offered me money to sign some custody relinquishment papers. I refused. The next day, our house burned. I don't believe in coincidences. If something happens to me, promise me you won't stop looking for him. Our son has the right to know who he is, and you have the right to call yourself a mother again. A voice from the grave, a father's love reaching across the decades. This isn't just a box of evidence. It's a testament to a man who knew evil was coming and did everything he could to leave a map for the truth. What James left behind is the key to not only finding a son, but to exposing a conspiracy." Ethan couldn't hold back his tears. Beatrice's voice trembled with each word, but she didn't stop. The folder contained copies of documents James had managed to gather before the fire, receipts of bank transfers, doctors' names, dates, and addresses. Everything pointed to a single conclusion. Her son was stolen with premeditation by a network of infant trafficking disguised as special adoptions. Ethan took the photograph. It was him as a child in the arms of an unknown woman. On the back of the photo, handwritten, it said, "Veronica's house, August 1974. Veronica Hayes," Ethan said, "the one who pretended to be your friend. She knew everything." Beatrice nodded, with contained anger. Veronica had been there after the fire, comforting her, bringing her food, telling her to trust the authorities. Always helpful, always close. Too close. Suddenly, Ethan noticed a crumpled paper at the bottom of the box. He took it out. It was a document stamped by the county clerk's office, but with a detail that chilled his blood. A clearly forged signature, impersonating Beatrice as the biological mother voluntarily giving up her son. "This," he said, showing the paper. "This was the perfect excuse to justify my adoption." Beatrice snatched it from his hands and examined it. "I never signed this. Never." Ethan understood in that instant. His identity had been erased with ink and fear. But before he could say anything more, the sound of an engine alerted them. Outside, a black SUV was parking in front of the house. Two men in suits got out and approached the gate. They didn't look lost. They were coming straight for them. "We have to go out the back," Ethan said, stuffing all the papers into a backpack. They went out the back door that led to the yard, and from there, they ran between the houses until they reached the back of the town church. They took refuge among the ancient walls, breathing heavily, their hearts pounding furiously. "Who were they?" Beatrice asked. "I don't know, but they weren't neighbors," Ethan said. "Someone is following us. Someone wants this buried again." He took out his cell phone and dialed a number. It was a journalist he had treated at the hospital months ago. He owed him a favor. "Omar, I need you to publish something that will shake all of Seattle." "Are you sure, Ethan?" "More than ever." While they talked, Beatrice took an object from the bottom of her purse that she hadn't shown in years. It was a small blue velvet box. Inside was the gold ring James had commissioned for his son, with his initials engraved, MJC. "This ring," she said, "was the only thing I had left of you." Ethan took it, looked at it intently, and without a word put it on. At that moment, they knew there was no turning back. And as they hid in the church, one of the men who had gotten out of the SUV was talking on the phone, staring at the facade of the abandoned house. "They're not here, but they have the papers, and if they hand them over, you'll go down too." The voice that answered on the other end of the line was cold, deliberate. "Then do what you have to do, but no mistakes this time." The black SUV had left Snoqualmie, but it left a trail of fear and adrenaline that Beatrice and Ethan couldn't shake. They returned to Seattle at nightfall, with the backpack full of documents and hearts heavier than ever. The proof was there, the names were there, but so was the danger. For the first time in her life, Beatrice felt that the truth she had searched for so long could cost her everything. In her house in the Beacon Hill neighborhood, the lights were off. Clara was waiting for them in the dark with a nervous gesture. She had received 2 visits in their absence. A woman with a hat who wouldn't give her name, and then 2 men who asked for Beatrice. They left no message, only threatening looks. Ethan closed the door and put the backpack on the table. He opened the window to let in some air, but the night seemed denser than usual. Everything was silent, except for the ticking of the old clock next to the Virgin Mary. Beatrice sat down, exhausted, her gaze lost. "What do we do now?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence. Beatrice lowered her head. Her mother's instinct, the one that had kept her going all these years, was now pulling her in another direction. Protect him even from the truth. She felt like her time was running out. "I'm afraid to go on," she finally said, her voice breaking. "I'm afraid they'll hurt you. If this continues, they'll crush us. They have no limits." Ethan looked at her with a mixture of tenderness and pain. He approached and took her hands. "All my life, I've lived without knowing who I was. I'd rather die knowing the truth than continue living a lie. Don't ask me to stop now." His words pierced her heart. She looked at him closely, the same childish gaze she remembered, but in a grown man. And in that instant, she understood that she could no longer protect him as before. The lost son had returned to claim his story, and nothing could stop him. "It's not my decision to make," she whispered. "It's yours. But remember, there are truths that not only hurt, they also kill." Ethan nodded but didn't answer. He stood up, went to the kitchen, and made 2 coffees. He returned with the steaming cups and placed them in front of her. They sat together in silence, like 2 allies in a war they still didn't know how to fight. Clara watched them from the doorway with silent tears. Then she approached the table and left them another envelope. It was smaller, written in hurried ink. Beatrice opened it. It was a newspaper clipping from 1974, child found dead on highway to Snoqualmie. The photo was blurry, but the caption clarified. The body could not be identified and was handed over to the authorities with no family claiming it. Beatrice felt a punch in the gut, not because she thought it was her son, she knew he was alive, but because she understood they had used that anonymous corpse to close the case and justify his disappearance. This is proof that everything was planned, she murmured. Ethan pressed his lips together. His anger was no longer just against Sharon or Margaret Montgomery. It was against an entire system that had allowed this to happen. Then we must report it, he said, with names and documents. No more anonymous letters, no more fear. Beatrice slowly stood up. She walked to the metal box where she kept her memories. She opened it and, with firm hands, took out the last piece of evidence she had been saving for herself. A letter written by Veronica Hayes, the woman who pretended to be her close friend. It was a confession written years ago, never sent, where she admitted to receiving money to hand the child over to people with more resources. Beatrice placed it on the table. With this, they won't be able to deny anything. The silence grew so deep, they could hear the rain starting outside. Ethan took the letter, folded it, and put it in his coat pocket. Tomorrow, I'm going to the district attorney's office, he said. No matter what happens. Beatrice looked him in the eyes. She knew that decision would put him at risk. She knew what was coming wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that for the first time in half a century, the truth was on her side. That night, before going to bed, Beatrice looked out the window. The street was deserted, but on the corner, under the streetlight, a car was parked with its engine running, 2 silhouettes inside. They didn't move, they didn't get out, they just waited. Beatrice's heart skipped a beat because she understood they weren't watching the house. They were waiting for someone to come out. The night in Seattle was dense, as if the low clouds wanted to crush the entire city. Ethan had been looking for Beatrice for hours. After that trip to Snoqualmie, she hadn't returned to the square, the market, or the church. She had disappeared from the neighborhood like a shadow. No one had seen her leave. No one knew anything. And yet, Ethan felt the answer wasn't in the streets, but in the house that had raised him, the Montgomery mansion. That same night, Sharon was in her office. She hadn't slept. In front of her was an untouched glass of whiskey, scattered papers, and a phone ringing incessantly. She didn't answer. Fear, for the first time in decades, had overcome her control. She had tried to talk to Margaret Montgomery, her mother, but that voice was no longer there. Only her shadow remained, her dirty legacy, and a son who was no longer hers. She stood up, walked around the room, touching the antique furniture as if they were anchors. In her hand, she held a letter she hadn't wanted to read until now. It was the confession Margaret had left her before she died. Inside, the paper smelled of old perfume and guilt. Sharon, you and I are the last ones who know what we did. That child was not ours, but I couldn't let him be lost among the ashes. His biological mother will never get him back, not while I live. Keep him as your own. Make him a Montgomery, and the world will believe the story you tell. If the truth ever catches up with you, remember that I did it for you. Sharon crumpled the letter in her hands, sank into the armchair, and for the first time, the mask fell completely. She cried, not from fear or shame. She cried for the girl who was manipulated, dragged into committing a crime that wasn't hers, but which she accepted for comfort. At that moment, the office door opened. Ethan was there, his gaze hard, his breathing ragged. I need to know the truth, he said bluntly. Sharon looked at him. Her son, her lie, her only truth for all those years. You already know it, she replied. I know fragments. I know I was bought, that I was erased, that I was raised in a lie, but I want to hear it from your mouth. What did you do? Sharon took a deep breath, walked towards him. The lamp's light highlighted the wrinkles on her face. I didn't buy you, she said. I received you. I was an accomplice. Yes, I didn't defend you. I didn't return you to your mother. I made you mine because I didn't know what to do with the truth. And with each passing year, it became harder, more impossible. Here, the mask finally falls. Sharon wasn't just a villain. She was a coward, trapped by her own mother's sins. It shows us how a single act of weakness can curdle into a lifetime of deceit, poisoning everyone it touches. Ethan didn't look away. His voice came out trembling but firm. "Did you know who my mother was?" "Yes, I always knew." Beatrice appeared at the door. She had arrived silently, guided by Clara, and had heard the last few sentences. Her shawl was soaked from the rain, her face hardened by decades of pain. "And you saw me every day," she said. "You saw me in the square selling flowers, and you said nothing." Sharon covered her face with her hands. "I couldn't," she murmured. "My mother watched me even after she was dead. She left me everything, but she also left me her shadow. And I didn't have the courage." The silence that followed was so heavy you could hear the 3 heartbeats in that room. Ethan took a step toward Sharon. His tone was not of hatred, but of judgment. "This is going to come out. Not to destroy you, but to free us." Sharon looked at him with reddened eyes. "If you do this, there will be no turning back. Everything will be over." "I know," he replied, "and I'm still going to do it." Beatrice approached, looking at Sharon with dignity. "I don't want to see you in prison. I just want my son to know who he is, for him to stop carrying your lie, for me to stop carrying your theft." Sharon lowered her head, knelt before Beatrice, and took her hand. "Forgive me," she whispered. "I can't undo what happened, but I can tell the truth. I can testify. I can sign whatever is necessary." Ethan took a deep breath. For the first time in months, he felt the scales begin to tip towards the light, but the calm was short-lived. A heavy silence descended upon the opulent room, thick with the weight of 50 years of lies. Ethan stood between the 2 women, a living bridge between 2 worlds. He looked at Sharon, the woman who had raised him, not with hatred, but with a profound, aching sorrow. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I could have loved you both. Why did it have to be a choice made of theft and silence?" Sharon finally broke. The facade of the powerful matriarch crumbled, revealing a woman trapped by her own mother's sins. "Because I was a coward," she confessed, tears streaming down her face. "My mother, she was a formidable woman. She wanted an heir, and she couldn't have one. She saw your son, Beatrice, and decided he would be hers. The fire. She arranged it. She saw an opportunity in a tragedy. I was young. I was terrified of her. I accepted you, Ethan, because I was too weak to defy her. And every year that passed, the lie became bigger, heavier, until it was the only truth I knew." She turned to Beatrice, her gaze pleading. "I saw you in the square. Every day. And every day, I felt a piece of my soul die. I told myself you were better off not knowing, that he was better off with wealth and privilege. But I was lying to myself. I robbed you of a life, Beatrice, and I robbed him of a mother." Beatrice listened, her expression unreadable. She walked slowly toward Sharon, not with anger, but with the quiet dignity of a survivor. She reached out and placed a hand on Sharon's shoulder. "The only thing I ever wanted," Beatrice said softly, "was for him to know he was loved from the very beginning. Your mother took my son, but you, Sharon, you kept him. You could have ended this pain at any time." She then turned to Ethan, her eyes shining with tears. "But now, you are here, and that is all that matters." Ethan and Beatrice looked at each other. Sharon stood up, pale as a sheet. They knew this was not a formal visit. It was the shadow of the Montgomerys moving once again to close the circle. The knocks on the door echoed like gunshots. Sharon shot up, her face distraught. Ethan stood up and went straight to Beatrice, who was clinging to the back of a chair as if the wood could support the weight of what was coming. "District Attorney's Office. Final warning." Sharon hesitated. Her eyes darted from Ethan to the door, as if calculating in seconds how many years of secrets could crumble with a single misspoken statement. Ethan was the one who took the first step. "I'm going to open it," he said in a firm voice. "Wait," Sharon cried. "If you open it, I can't protect you anymore." He stopped, turned to her with his eyes burning with a truth that could no longer be hidden. "You never protected me. You hid me, you denied me. You raised me in a lie that wasn't yours, but you made it mine." The door knocked again, this time less forcefully. A knock, then silence. "Ethan," Sharon said, her voice broken, "before you go into that room, before you sign anything, let me tell you something that no one else can." Beatrice remained quiet. She just lowered her head, gritting her teeth. Sharon approached slowly. She had an envelope in her hand. She had hidden it in the false bottom of her desk drawer for years. She handed it to him. "Open it." Ethan tore open the envelope. Inside was a yellowed sheet, handwritten, with a heading that read, "Childhood Memories, Michael James." They were a child's words, loose phrases, simple thoughts. "My mommy calls me Mickey, only she calls me that, no one else. And when I'm scared, she sings softly in my ear. She says, 'The fears go out through your neck.'" Beatrice snapped her head up. "What did you say?" Ethan read again, aloud, "Mickey, and the thing about the fears." Beatrice approached him slowly. Her lips were trembling. "That, only I knew that. Only I called him that, Mickey. Since he was a baby, not even James used it. It was our secret, and when he cried, I would tell him that the fears came out through his neck, and I would blow softly behind his ear until he fell asleep." Ethan put his hand to the back of his neck, as if something forgotten were awakening on his skin. "I remember that," he whispered. "What?" "The blowing. Every time I was sick or had a bad dream, I felt someone blowing behind my ear. I thought it was something I made up, but I remember it. Since I was a child, Beatrice couldn't hold back any longer. She hugged him, not with the desperation of a mother mourning a lost child, but with the silent peace of someone who has survived hell just to hold again what life took from her. Sharon watched them, standing, broken inside. The doorbell rang again, this time accompanied by a calmer call. "Is Dr. Ethan Montgomery home?" Ethan pulled away from Beatrice, went to the door, and opened it. 3 agents from the DA's office introduced themselves with credentials. They didn't come with weapons or violence. They brought documents. "We need you to come with us. It's in relation to an open investigation into irregularities in your adoption. You have been summoned as the complaining party, not as a suspect." Ethan breathed a sigh of relief. "I'll go gladly," he replied, "but she must testify too." He pointed to Sharon, who said nothing. The agent nodded. "That's anticipated." Sharon looked up. "I'll do it. I'll tell everything, but under one condition." "Which is?" Sharon turned to Beatrice. "I want to do it in front of her and in front of him, without lawyers, without judges, just the 3 of us. Because if this chapter is going to close, it must be done with the truth face to face." The agent hesitated. Then he looked at Ethan, and he, for the first time, said without hesitation, "I accept. But it will be today. I won't wait any longer." Hours later, the 3 of them were sitting in a room at the DA's office. There were no cameras, no media, just a prosecutor, a clerk, and 2 recorders running. Sharon began to speak. "My name is Sharon Montgomery, and I voluntarily declare that the child known as Ethan Montgomery was not legally adopted. He was given to our family through an illegal operation organized by my mother, Margaret Montgomery, with the collaboration of a woman named Veronica Hayes. The child was taken after a fire. His biological mother is Beatrice Calderon Ramirez. I knew from the first moment, and I kept silent for 50 years. The silence settled like a tomb. The prosecutor nodded. He continued asking questions. Ethan answered. Beatrice too. At the end, the clerk read the final clause of the statement. "Are you willing to cede the rights of surname and inheritance over Ethan Montgomery?" Sharon didn't hesitate. "Yes, let him have the name that belongs to him. Let him be who he should have been from the first day." Beatrice burst into tears. Ethan hugged her. And when they left the building, 2 journalists were waiting for them. The rumor had already started to circulate. The story of the doctor, the florist, and the Montgomery scandal. But before they could say a word, a black car pulled up in front of them. An elegant woman with silver hair and eyes like knives got out. Veronica Hayes. "You thought it was all over," she said, looking directly at Beatrice. "But the worst is yet to come. And I don't plan on staying quiet." Veronica Hayes stopped in front of them with a calculated calm. The wool coat she wore hung impeccably over her shoulders. In her right hand, she held a small leather briefcase, but her real weapon was her tongue. Every word she spoke had a sharp edge, and every step she took was like a piece placed with precision on a board she knew by heart. Beatrice looked at her without fear. "What more could you do to me that you haven't already done?" Veronica smiled. "I didn't come to threaten you, Beatrice. I came to warn you. You don't understand what you're awakening. There are names in this story you haven't yet spoken. People with more power than you can imagine. People who won't stand by and watch you destroy their family names on the news." Ethan stepped forward, positioning himself between them. "Does that include you? Or are you just here to clean up your image before everything blows up?" Veronica looked him up and down. "You don't know who you really are," she said with a coldness that chilled his skin. "You think your story ends with the Montgomery name, but it goes much further. It wasn't just a purchased baby, it was a pact, a transaction between families, a dirty exchange to save a dying name. And you were the currency." Beatrice felt her legs grow weak. Veronica's voice wasn't lying. It wasn't disguised as a threat. It was the raw truth, like a blast of ice, cold water straight to the face. "And what did you gain?" Ethan asked. "How much were you paid to keep quiet?" Veronica lifted her chin with pride. "I didn't do it for money. I did it for loyalty, for obedience to a woman who saved me when I had nothing. Margaret Montgomery gave me a roof, food, power, and an order, and I carried it out to the end." Beatrice stepped forward. "And in carrying it out, you took my son from me." Veronica looked down. For the first time in decades, her mask cracked. "I was fond of you, Beatrice, really. But you were poor, alone, with no allies, and that child deserved more. Or so I believed at the time." "Don't you dare," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "Don't you dare justify what you did with pretty words. You stole me, you erased me, you fabricated a life for me that wasn't mine. You turned me into a product, a living room trophy." Veronica took a deep breath, took a thick envelope from her briefcase. "Here is the last of the evidence," she said. "The fake adoption contract, the signature of the bought-off judge, and the sheet that you, Beatrice, supposedly signed, authorizing the handover. There was never any law, only power. Now it's your decision what to do with this." She left the envelope in Ethan's hands and turned to leave, but before crossing the street, she stopped. "Oh, I almost forgot." She opened a small red velvet case and held it in the air. Inside was a gold ring with a tiny blue stone. She showed it in her open palm. This was on the child's ankle when he was handed over. "They never took it off him. They hid it. They erased it. But I kept it because I knew that one day that child would return and would want proof. The final, irrefutable piece of the puzzle, delivered by the one person you'd least expect, Veronica, the friend who betrayed Beatrice, now provides the ultimate validation. It is a twisted act of confession, but it gives Beatrice and Michael the one thing they need to close this chapter for good." Beatrice approached slowly, her eyes full of tears. She took the ring with trembling hands, turned it over, and there, engraved inside, were the initials she knew by heart. MJC. Michael James Calderon. She held it up high as if the world needed to see it, as if every tear, every sleepless night, every flower sold in silence finally made sense. "It's him," she whispered. "It's my son. It always was." Ethan hugged her, not with rage or pain, but with love, with that deep love that can only grow between blood and destiny. He finally understood why he had always felt that emptiness. He finally had a name that belonged to him, a history, a truth, and even though it hurt, it was his. Veronica was gone. She had disappeared down the street, just another shadow from the past, but her words still vibrated in the air. That night, Ethan went to the local newspaper. He gave the journalist the documents, the proof, the signatures, and a personal note. "My real name is Michael James Calderon. This is my story. It's not a pretty story, but it's mine, and I'm no longer ashamed to tell it." When he left the building, the city was quiet, and looking up at the sky, he knew the next day would change everything. But he didn't imagine how much, because when he returned home, a new envelope with no return address was waiting for him on the dining room table. And when he opened it, there was only one sentence, handwritten, "See you at Sunday Mass." The Sunday morning dawned with a clear sky, without clouds, as if the city had been waiting for this day for 50 years. The sound of the bells of St. James Cathedral echoed in downtown Seattle with more force than ever. The air smelled of freshly baked bread, incense, and something more. Of truth. Beatrice, dressed in her best shawl, the dark blue one with embroidered flowers she rarely wore except for special occasions. She looked in the mirror, saw the lines on her face, the eyes that no longer trembled, and placed on her chest the medal that Ethan had returned to her 2 nights before. She carried no fear. She carried history. She carried justice. Ethan arrived for her right on time. He wore a white shirt, dark pants, and the ring with his initials on his ring finger. His gaze no longer sought answers. He had found them all. Now it was his turn to share them. They walked to the church together. Outside, there were already media outlets, a couple of cameras, local journalists, and many people who didn't know for sure why they were there but had heard the rumors. Dr. Montgomery is going to say something about his origins. The flower lady has something to tell. The murmurs grew. Some didn't believe, others already knew, but everyone waited. Inside the church, the pews were full. Clara was sitting in the front row next to Megan from the market, and Ruth, the old woman who had seen everything in Snoqualmie. Even Sharon was there. She had arrived alone, her head uncovered, without makeup or security. She wore black and held her mother's rosary in her hand. The priest finished the mass with a brief prayer. Then, before leaving, he looked at Ethan, nodded respectfully, and stepped aside. Ethan went up to the altar, took a deep breath, and looked at everyone. "My legal name for 30 years was Ethan Montgomery," he said in a firm voice. "But today, in front of you, and with a full heart, I come to say my true name, Michael James Calderon." A murmur went through the church. "I was stolen from my biological mother's arms during an intentionally set fire. I was illegally adopted by a powerful family who built my life on lies. And today, after half a century of silence, I am here to give back to my mother what she should never have lost. Her place, her name, and her son, Beatrice." From her seat, she covered her mouth with both hands. Tears rolled down her face uncontrollably. Clara sobbed silently. No one moved. "I want everyone to hear this," Ethan continued. "My mother, Beatrice Calderon Ramirez, is not a broken woman. She is a mother who endured everything: poverty, abandonment, public humiliation, and she did it without hatred. Only with love." He turned to her. "Mom," he said in front of everyone, "thank you for not stopping your search for me. Thank you for teaching me that truth is planted, even if it takes decades to blossom." The applause was spontaneous. First one, then everyone, standing. The entire church applauded, not out of morbid curiosity, not for scandal, but for justice. Sharon lowered her head, a tear crossing her face. In that instant, she understood that she was no longer the protagonist of anything, just a figure from the past, a witness to what could have been and was not. When the mass ended, Beatrice and Ethan left, arm in arm. Outside, the journalists were waiting, the cameras were rolling, but it no longer mattered. Ethan stopped in front of a reporter's microphone. "What is your message, Dr. Calderon?" they asked. "That the truth is never buried forever," he replied. "And that there are mothers who don't need DNA to prove a child is theirs. The heart is enough." Before leaving, Beatrice turned to Sharon, who was still on the church steps. She approached and offered her hand. Sharon hesitated, then accepted it. "I hold no grudge," Beatrice told her. "But it's up to you whether you want to carry this to the end or start anew." Sharon didn't reply, just hugged her briefly and left alone. As the first rays of sun passed through the bell tower, Ethan walked with his mother towards the main square. People greeted him with respect. No one murmured. No one judged. The woman who had sold flowers for years was no longer invisible. She was a mother recovered. But just as they were crossing the corner of the market, a figure stopped them. It was a young man of about 30, looking nervous, with a folder in his hand. "Excuse me, are you Beatrice Calderon?" "Yes, I am," she said serenely. The young man opened the folder. Inside was an officially sealed lawsuit. "You have to appear to testify," he said. "A relative of the Montgomerys has filed a complaint for defamation. improper use of confidential documents, and violation of family privacy. The world stopped for a moment. Ethan snatched the folder. Who signed it? The young man swallowed. Veronica Hayes. The world stopped for a moment. The paper trembled in Ethan's hand. After 50 years of searching, of pain, of finally finding each other, the fight was not over. It had just entered a new, more public, and perhaps more brutal chapter. Beatrice looked at her son, not with fear, but with a quiet resolve that had been forged in decades of silent suffering. She took his hand, her grip firm. The murmurs of the crowd, the flashing cameras, the official notice, none of it mattered as much as the simple, unbreakable truth of the moment. They were mother and son, and they would face this together. Their story was not over. It had just truly begun. Their story is proof that love can heal all wounds. If you also believe in the power of truth and compassion, please subscribe to the channel to help us spread more meaningful stories like this one.